All right, so it's really my pleasure to be introducing Daniel here at Cornell. This is really wonderful to have him here to present on his really exceptional research. As a scientist, he's not only intellectually rigorous, but incredibly creative, really posing very challenging research questions, examining how language and culture and bodily experience influence the way that people think and feel and make decisions. So Daniel received his PhD in 2005 from MIT. He went on to an RSA-funded postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University before going on to the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, and then a research fellowship at the Donders before coming back to North America for an assistant professorship at the New School in New York City, prior to relocating then again as an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, which is from where he joins us today. I hear, the rumor has it there, he's a beloved instructor. He's also very much involved in outreach, where he is the scientific director of the Think Tank, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing diversity in STEM. So, as I mentioned, he's just incredibly prolific. He's the author of over 75 articles and chapters. This work is extremely well recognized and well funded, both by federal grants and private foundation money. And really, I'm just going to name a few of the awards that he's received recently that really speak to the excellence and the quality of scholarship. Daniel Casasanto received the American Psychological Association's the Robert France Memorial Award for Young Psychologists. He also received the Association for Psychological Sciences Janet Taylor Spence Award for Transformational Early Career Contributions. And finally, the Psychonomic Society Early Career Award for Exceptional Research Contributions to Scientific Psychology. So please join me in welcoming Daniel.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you for having me. So this talk will be a quick tour of some work in my lab on how ways of thinking are influenced by our habits of interacting with the physical and the social world. So the big question that motivates all of this work is, how has experience with the physical and social environment shaped our brains and minds over evolutionary time, resulting in a core set of cognitive capacities that may be universal, what Katie Kinsler and colleagues have referred to as core knowledge? And in what ways are our brains and minds shaped continually by our ongoing interactions with the physical and social environment? So the assumption, something that I probably don't have to defend too vigorously here, is that neural and cognitive development doesn't end in childhood, that developmental processes operate on various timescales throughout the lifespan, and that if we want to understand how our brains and minds work, we need to study how they operate in the context of the people, the artifacts, the attitudes, the practices, the institutions, et cetera, that make up the environment in which we do our thinking. So sometimes, in pursuit of these kinds of questions, my colleagues and I test kids or babies or monkeys, but often the developmental questions that we work on can be addressed, and sometimes can only be addressed, in grown-ups. And most of the work that I'll talk about today is in fact in grown-ups. For the purpose of figuring out what's influencing what, I tend to divide our context, our environment, into these three bubbles and ask, how our experience with language or with culture or with our individual bodies shapes the way we think, shapes our thoughts, shapes our feelings, and how these thoughts and feelings are instantiated in our brains. If we had time, I would love to present a little vignette from each of these bubbles. Because I don't want to be too rushed, I'm going to stick to these two and leave language for another time, but I'm happy to talk about questions about language affecting cognition if people are interested. Excuse me. Again, in this department, it may not be obligatory, but ordinarily it's important to raise the question why my collaborators and I spend so much time thinking about how context shapes our brains and minds. Well, as Chi has recently argued about effects of culture, it's not necessarily because we're interested in discovering differences or pointing out instances of cognitive diversity. This is a project that Noam Chomsky once referred to dismissively as butterfly collecting. Sometimes we discover differences across individuals or groups that are themselves illuminating or important, perhaps because of their translational potential, because of their policy implications, but often that's not the goal. Often, testing for individual or group differences is a tool, is a means rather than an end, a tool to understand how experience shapes our brains and minds, to discover mechanisms of neural and cognitive development that may be shared across all humans, not just in the groups that we're testing, to interpret previously unexplained data that may appear mysterious when viewed through the lens of a single ecological system. As I hope to illustrate, to rewrite, in some cases, some influential theories that have assumed universality and appear to be incorrect as a consequence, and to generate and test new theories, not just about how our brains and minds work, but about why they work that way. So, excuse me. Time is one of the domains that has been a springboard for lots of studies in my lab. It's one of the oldest topics in experimental psychology, and yet it's remarkable how much we still don't know. One strategy that we do know people use to apprehend time is metaphor. In some cases, people use poetic metaphors, like Salvador Dali's here, where to him he wrote, "Time was like camembert cheese melting in the sun." Well, that's not how we ordinarily think about time, right? The kind of metaphors that we usually use are much more mundane, so mundane that you might not even recognize them to be metaphorical ways of talking and certainly not of thinking. We don't talk about time ordinarily in terms of cheese, but rather in terms of space. One of the most discussed spatial metaphors in English is our metaphor for temporal posteriority and anteriority. We can't help talking about the future as if it's ahead and the past as if it's behind, way back in the past, right? And in a seminal paper about this pattern in language, my revered postdoc advisor, Herbert Clark, proposed that we don't just talk about time using spatial words. More fundamentally, we think about time as flowing along a spatial continuum that's oriented along this sagittal front-back axis. Now, how does this work? Well, Clark posited that this way of thinking arose because we have an intrinsic front to our body. Our sensory organs, our hands, our feet are oriented toward the front, and therefore typically we move through space and through time in this direction, not that direction, or sideways like a crab. As we walk, the places that we will travel to in the future lie literally ahead of us. The places we've already passed lie literally behind us. So this correlation between space and time gets encoded in our minds and enshrined in our languages on the basis of this universal aspect of our bodies and the way we use them to interact with the natural world. Pretty good story, huh? A lot of people generated a lot of research on the basis of this chapter. Herb used to tell me, if you ever have a good idea, don't put it in the book chapter. It was hard to believe, given that this has been cited. Everything I write, I have to cite this darn chapter. Excuse me. What English speakers, and in fact speakers of all known spoken languages, will never say is something like, that happened way left in the past, or that's going to be far right in the future. We just don't use right and left in this way to talk about mappings of time. And people following Clark generated lots of text about why this might be. The conclusion, as summarized by linguist Gunther Raden, is that the sagittal axis with its front-back orientation apparently captures our experience of time better than the lateral axis with its left-right orientation, which does not seem to offer any sensible spatial basis for understanding time at all. This is a widely accepted conclusion, and yet there was this problematic finding from another one of my mentors, Barbara Tversky, who in 1991 gave people a diagram task. Said, here's a piece of paper. I'm going to put this sticker in the middle. This sticker is lunch. Here are two more stickers. You show me where breakfast and dinner go. Well, as your intuitions may support, most English speakers put breakfast, lunch, and dinner in a row like this. They could have done any arrangement on the page. It didn't even have to be a line, but this was the modal answer, suggesting that we map time laterally, even though it's not supposed to provide any sensible basis for time at all. There are a number of possible explanations for this pattern. My first thought, when first encountering this, was, hey, wait a minute. Maybe this is a task artifact. Maybe this mapping of space on time was basically created in the lab, because if you ask people to represent something that they think about sagittally on a two-dimensional plane, they have to figure out some solution to that problem, right? But maybe this mapping, although it was systematic, does not reveal the way that English speakers typically conceptualize the progress of events in time. And maybe we would get a different answer if we moved to a paradigm that had a little better ecological validity, where you had two naive people who were talking to each other and behaving freely, more or less. So I brought in pairs of participants and asked them to take turns telling stories. These stories happened to be about the past or the future. Unbeknownst to them, we were interested in how they would gesture. If people can behave freely, gesturing spontaneously in three dimensions, they're going to gesture sagittally, right? The way we move through space and time, the way language tells us that we map space and time, right? Okay, so we'll solve this problem. Here we go. Watch these sagittal gestures.
Okay, so I'm writing a report about how farming methods are changed over the course of the 20th century. The farming methods used by modern farmers are a lot different than the farming methods used at the earlier in the century, which was much more primitive. Like today, they use diesel-powered tractors to plow the fields, whereas only like half a century ago, they were using horse-drawn plows. And then a generation before that, they had to do everything by hand. So I wonder how life is different than for the farmers at the beginning of the 20th century compared to modern farmers.
Interesting.
Yeah, really interesting stories. So you saw those front-back gestures, right? Not one, right? Now, obviously, I've cherry-picked this example. He's got really big hands. He gestures a lot, right? What he's gesturing systematically for time. He's putting later events on the right, earlier events on the left, a generation ago and a generation before that. This is an analog spatial continuum where farther into the past is farther to the right. And if instead of cherry picking, you analyze all of the speech and all of the gesture from this whole corpus, what we see is a very systematic pattern where people are gesturing spontaneously leftward for earlier events and rightward for later events. Now, if we look at all the subjects and all the data, what do we see on the sagittal axis? Nothing. People did sometimes gesture, but from this, all we could conclude is people like to gesture forward. Right? There's no systematic relationship between the direction of their gestures and the direction in time that they're talking about. So that's unexpected. What's going on here? Well, one proposal was, well, maybe people are spatializing time because, in this way, because we have these graphic representations of time, like days of week arrayed on the calendar. I think that's perfectly plausible, and I'm not going to argue against it. But I want to argue there may be a much more ubiquitous and basic kind of culture-specific experience that is, if not the only source, a sufficient source for this kind of lateral mapping of time. And that is not a spatial mapping of time per se, but just the act of reading. How does this work? Well, actually, we can tell the same kind of story that Herb Clark was telling, a sort of transformation of this story about moving through space and time along a linear path. Each line that we read on a page in our culture, we start on the left of the page at an earlier moment and progress gradually through space and time, ending up at the right at a later moment. So we're reinforcing this earlier is left, later is right over and over just through the act of reading, presumably no matter what we're reading about. To test whether this was sufficient excuse me, to affect the way people are thinking about time spatially, my postdoc Roberto Bottini and I gave Dutch speakers what is now a very standard kind of space-time interference reaction time task, where they had to judge the meaning of temporal phrases like a year earlier or a decade later pressing the right button for later times, the left button for earlier times, or vice versa, and you compute the difference in reaction times for congruent versus incongruent. And what we see when they're reading phrases in standard orthography is that they're faster to press the left button for past word phrases, the right button for future word phrases. After about 5 minutes of exposure to mirror reversed orthography, though, we see a complete reversal of this pattern. Now they're not saying the heck with space. I'll just throw space away. It's not giving me any help here. They adopt a completely backwards spatial mapping, where consistent with the direction of the flow of time as you read backwards orthography, left is associated with future and right with past in their reaction times. So if you're curious about how the heck this kind of change could happen so quickly, how could 5 minutes of reading backward overwhelm a lifetime of experience reading the regular way, I'd be happy to talk about that in the question period. I've been working on a theory that I believe explains this effect and a bunch of other data like it that we've accumulated. What's relevant at the moment is that we now have reason to believe that people spontaneously map time onto the lateral axis of space. This was not created in the lab. And based on our gesture data, this may be the dominant mental timeline in English speakers' minds. And yet, it can't be explained excuse me, by either of the experiential factors that have been pointed to previously, either direct interactions with the natural world or with language. So we were exploring this further. And again, taking it to a more naturalistic paradigm, looking at spontaneous gestures, and in Spaniards versus Moroccans, cultures that have writing directions that go in opposite directions, and analyzing their left-right gestures, we found just what we expected on the basis of the previous data that I've shown you, that Spaniards look like the English speakers, earlier is left, later is right. Moroccans showed the opposite pattern. Okay, confirmation is nice. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because in the same data set, we analyzed sagittal gestures, in partly just as a comparison condition, and to confirm this, what was then very surprising finding, that people weren't gesturing sagittally for time. And indeed, we did confirm that in Spanish speakers. 50% is no preference for future ahead or past ahead in gestures. They were almost perfectly at 50%. But the Moroccans were not at 50%. They were at almost 100% systematic use of the sagittal axis for gesturing about time. You might wonder whether this effect is statistically significant. The answer is yes. But what's going on here? Do you see the direction of this effect? These Moroccan people are gesturing what we would think of as backwards for time, right? They're putting the past in front of them almost all the time. Now, right, so this is the dark is past in front and will be in a bunch of graphs that we'll see in a moment. Excuse me. So I don't think we can explain this on the basis of reversed writing direction, right? It's not clear how you could. Can we explain it on the basis of the sort of Clarkean physical experience? Well, no. To our knowledge, Moroccans don't typically walk backwards. Can we? This kind of backward mapping had been documented once before in an Andean tribe, the Aymara. But there, the explanation offered was that, well, they talk about time backwards. They have a system where their word for past is the same as the word for eye and sight and front. And their intuitions about this is, oh, well, the past is knowable and therefore seeable, right? And so that mapping is enshrined in their language and their culture and their gesture and by inference in their thoughts. But there's nothing like that in Arabic. Arabic space-time metaphors are much like ours and much like the front-back space-time metaphors that have been attested in many, many languages, every language, in fact, that I know of except for Aymara. So my first intuition was to say, well, despite those p-values, what are our priors, right? We need to interpret those p-values in context. Of course, this is probably a fluke. But it bore a little more investigation. So step one was to go back to Morocco. This is speakers of Daria, which is a dialect spoken in the city Tetuan, and to replicate this finding, or attempt to replicate it with a complementary method. So this is a diagram task. It's very silly. My lab has gotten outrageous amounts of mileage out of such a dumb paradigm, where people are told that Bob here has certain preferences or certain activities. In this case, they were told, oh, sorry, Bob is either Juan or Mohammed. Juan or Mohammed will visit a friend tomorrow who likes animals. Yesterday, he visited a friend who likes plants, right? Or vice versa, depending upon the version of the questionnaire that you get. Your job is to indicate which box best represents things that will happen tomorrow, like going to see the animal friend, and which box best represents things that happened yesterday, like going to see the plant lover. And Spaniards did just what we expected. The question is, where did they put the past? Well, 88% of the time, they put the past behind them. We have no real explanation for these 12%, but it's a very strong preference to put the past behind and the future ahead. Moroccans did exactly the opposite. 85% of the Moroccans are spatializing the past ahead of them, not just in their gesture, but in this diagram task as well. So we have something to explain here that we can't explain on the basis of natural interactions with the physical environment or on the basis of language. What's going on? So step 2 is rule out all of the explanations that we can think of and posit a new one. Here's the thought. Suppose you live in a culture where the majority of men who you know are named after ancient prophets. Suppose you and just about everyone you know prostrate yourselves 5 times a day en masse to enact the same ancient rituals. That would be a culture that is quite different from the one that we live in. That would be a culture that engages very seriously with the past. Now, this sounds like we're making up stories, and in fact, we were, by reviewers, accused of being racist. This is not racism. Ask anyone in this culture, right? Or ask ethnographers who have studied this culture, and in fact, ethnographers who've compared Moroccan to Spanish culture, and you'll hear stories about this focus on the past. Whereas we have idioms about the bright future, they have idioms about the bright past. It's a complete reversal of focus. So here's the proposal. Maybe the past is in front if you tend to focus on that pole of the temporal continuum. We call this the temporal focus hypothesis. It goes like this. People conceptualize events in time as if they were objects in space. We can hardly prevent ourselves from reifying non-physical things, right, and treating them as if they were objects. Some people tend to focus their attention more on the past or more on the future, and this varies across individuals and across groups. Maybe what's going on here is that people place in front of them whichever pole of the temporal continuum they tend to, quote, focus on, right? As if these events were objects that we could put in front of our faces and see. How do we find out? Well, the next step is to go beyond anecdote and ethnography and try to quantify these differences in temporal focus across cultures. This has nothing to do with spatial mappings for the moment. It's just how strongly do you agree with statements like traditions and customs are very important for me versus technological advances are good for society, right? You give a rating for each one of these, half future-focused, half past-focused phrases. And what we find is just what we would expect from talking to people who are members of these cultures, which is that compared to Spaniards, Moroccans were much more past-focused. Okay, so now we've got a post hoc explanation for this very surprising cross-cultural difference in how people spatialize time. How can we test it? Well, instead of looking across cultures, why don't we look within a culture across the lifespan? So there's a literature associated with the reminiscence bump that suggests that whereas younger people, at least younger people in the cultures that they were testing, are more future-focused, older people tend to be more past-focused, right? Reflecting on the past. Now, in talking with Corinna this morning, I think that what's critical here is that they are more past-focused compared to the younger people. Corinna was suggesting maybe, in fact, they're not past-focused per se, maybe they're present-focused. And actually, I'd never interpreted the data that way, but that's exactly what the data show. And so the claim is not that older people are past-focused, it's they're more past-focused. Thank you, as we'll see in a moment. So What does that predict about their spatialization of time? Well, even within Spanish culture, young Spaniards are 90% future ahead. Older Spaniards from a retirement home are much, much more likely to put the past ahead. It's not a completely reversal like we saw in the Moroccans, but just being older gets you about halfway to Morocco. So we kind of couldn't believe that any of this was actually working. So the next step was an internal replication where we repeated these tests across cultures and across the lifespan, and indeed confirmed that young Spaniards are more future-focused, young Moroccans are more past-focused, and older Spaniards are relatively more past-focused, but as Corinna pointed out, they're in fact neither, these data suggest they're neither past-focused nor future-focused. So cool, I've learned so much in part of a day. This variation in temporal focus aligns with the tendency to put the past or the future in front. Young Spaniards put the future in front. Young Moroccans put the past in front, and older Spaniards are intermediate.
And so we could eliminate cohort effects by having history majors.
Excuse me. Yes, excellent. So we have looked at some other within culture differences. So for example, Hasidic Jews versus the general population on the New York subway, pregnant women versus non-pregnant women who are coming into the same clinic as controls. And in fact, you do see these kinds of within culture variations just as the hypothesis predicts. Now that's still all correlation between temporal focus, be it culturally induced or life stage induced, and the way people are spatializing time. The next step, of course, is that we want a causal test of this hypothesis, right? Is it true that beyond this correlation within or across cultures, that temporal focus is what's making people conceptualize time differently? Please.
Question.
Yeah.
In the previous slide,
Mm-hmm.
is the relationship between these two constructs also related at the individual level?
Yes. So if we let me make sure. The answer is yes, and I would need to double check because we now have lots of data sets like this. But I believe it's the case that if you use individuals' a continuous score to predict their binary choice here, so you don't get a lot of variability in the DV to predict, that age group predicts response, culture predicts response, but that if you control for age group, it removes the effect of culture, and if you control for culture, it removes the effect of the age group.
So in other words, the temporal focus would sort of the mediator for that contribute to the group differences in the space-time mapping.
It's possible, yeah. I'm sorry, I said that completely wrong. If you control it, that you can control for one, and it doesn't remove the other effect, so that we know that it's not. We know that it's not, the cross-cultural effect is not due to unintended age differences, right? Yeah?
We were talking about that. So past focus and future focus are independent based on your, the questions are separate. So you have both, you could be both past and future focus on the questionnaire.
Right.
Does either of that, do you, so which one?
For the correlational analyses that I was just mentioning, we computed a temporal focus index, which is just an asymmetry score.
Okay.
So we combined these two into a single number. I don't know the answer to if you used one or the other of these as a predictor independently, what's the answer? But we could certainly find out.
No, that's okay. I just was wondering what you were using to make these.
Yeah, we smushed them into an index.
It seems to me that age may actually be a corollary variable of a person's individual focus, as in how much, in terms of your goals, how much do you have left to accomplish in your life? And there's some older people who really have a lot that they still want to do, but most
Right.
on average may be retired and don't.
Right.
And there may be some younger people who retired and they go to the golf course and look at their best years behind.
Yeah.
So I wonder about people just using age rather than what psychologically is. The other thing I'm hoping you'll talk about that I've never understood is politically the right versus the left, because they seem reversed to me. And if you could explain that, I'd be grateful, because I've wondered about it.
Sure. Should we digress into that for a moment? Okay. Okay. So we'll come back to. I mean, hey, this is your time. I'm not getting paid either way, right? So there are lots of different abstract ideas that we map to the lateral axis. Time is one. We'll see in a little while. Valence is another. Politics is a third. And we have evidence that each of these three has different experiential bases and behaves according to different sets of rules. So where did the left-right mapping of politics come from? Well, the ostensive source is the French National Assembly in the late 18th century, where, for whatever reason, we can discuss what that reason is, the liberals were seated on the left and the conservatives on the right of this aisle in this giant hall. And how did that knowledge get transmitted to us? Well, this became a metonymic way of referring to people who have these political views. Using left or right was a metonymic way of referring to people with these views or these views. And then that started to be used across cultures. It jumped from French to English. It actually caused us, apparently, to organize our Senate the same way. Is that how it got to our heads? No, most of us are not senators. If you see it on C-SPAN, you see it from all different angles, so that's not really going to help. Presumably, the source of this is language. Whereas the source of the left-right mapping of time can't possibly be language. No one ever talks about time that way. A question that I would love to know the answer to is how these different abstract domains that share the same source domain, that both map to the lateral axis, interact with each other. So for example, thinking about left-right politics and left-right time, is it the case excuse me, that liberals are more positively disposed to the past and conservatives to the future, right? It wouldn't seem that that's true.
Yeah, it seems almost the opposite.
Right? It's in fact, right. If we replace liberal with progressive, it should be exactly the opposite. So far, we've found no evidence for that kind of interaction of different source domains that share the same, different target domains that share the same spatial source. Please.
So while we're on politics, I guess I'm wondering, it seems to me that a lot of the few items you gave on the temporal focus scale are really similar to the kinds of items that political or social psychologists would use to assess someone for being liberal or conservative, not as a Democrat or Republican necessarily, but as in, adhering to the status quo versus being interested in the possibility of change.
Right.
And so I guess I'm wondering, how closely does temporal focus map onto
Political views. Yep. So we're working on that now. I don't know the answer to that. So could this construct that we're calling temporal focus be constituted in part by political views? Could it be constituted in part by your goals and therefore correlated with life stage, but not necessarily causally associated with it? That's the issue with correlational research, right? There are lots of different factors that could be relevant or not. And we don't know. So that's why we need to do a true experimental intervention where we don't put people in a different life stage. We don't change their goals and motivations. We don't change their political orientation. All we do is ask them to say, where did you travel last year? Or where do you think you're going to travel next year? What were you afraid of in the past? What do you think you'll be afraid of in the future? So we give them this little writing exercise where we ask them the same questions, either reflecting on the past or projecting into the future, just forcing them to think about the past or the future for about 5 minutes, and then give them our silly diagram task. After the future induction exercise, the young Spaniards were even more likely, even closer to ceiling, to put the future in front of them. After about 5 minutes of writing about their past, the young Spaniards who were randomly assigned to the past induction were much more likely to put the past in front of them, like older people or Moroccans. So once again, just thinking about the past for a little while gets you about halfway to Morocco. So we have evidence, excuse me, that something about focusing your attention on the past or the future plays a causal role in establishing the direction of this spatial mapping of time, front versus back, consistent with this idea that we conceptualize as in front of us whatever pole of the temporal continuum we are, quote, focusing on. So to wrap up this part of the talk, for about 40 years, we thought we knew how people spatialize time in their minds, at least English speakers and other Westerners. We thought the mapping arose from universal properties of the body and of its interaction with the natural world, and that it was reflected in metaphors and language. It turns out that there's this lateral mapping of time that is based not on the natural world, but on interacting with cultural artifacts like writing systems, and is completely absent from spoken language. And then there's this other sagittal mapping that is backwards of spoken language, backwards of the way we move through the natural world, and appears to depend on an interplay between culture-specific attitudes and values about time, be they past-focused or future-focused, and the individual's temporal focus, which both follows from and reinforces these culture-specific attitudes. So to summarize all of this, by considering the mind in a cultural context, we unlearn lots of dogma from cognitive psychology and linguistics, and learn a bunch of stuff about the mechanisms by which people construct their conceptions of time. So I can pause there before we switch gears. Other thoughts about temporal focus? This is wide open research, so I'm really happy to hear your thoughts, please.
I'm curious if you or anyone has done anything with the picture arrangement task on the waist of the whisk where do you know what I'm talking? You're
Yes.
given like 4 cards and you're told to put them in sequential order in front of you. And because it's a psychometric task, it's very structured and people are told, put the first card here, the second card next to it, the third.
Right.
So they're told to do it in a left to right orientation. But that kind of arrangement could be really manipulated quite easily. And you could also rely on people's natural tendencies for where do they place one versus the beginning versus the end.
Yep. So cultural psychologists have used a task like that without the confound of telling people about space or number, right? And just give you a little stack of cards, and one of them will be a totally unpeeled banana, one of them is a half-peeled banana, and the other is a yet-to-be peeled banana, right? And you're just told, people across cultures are told just arrange these cards however makes sense to you. Of course, if you do that for Western college students, they will do unpeeled, half-peeled, totally peeled, just like the breakfast, lunch, dinner task. If you do it with Hebrew speakers, they'll tend to do it the opposite. There are other cultures, I believe the Temporal and Aboriginal tribe will make a stack of them. Yeah, no, sorry, the Temporal do it, that's not true. The Temporal, do it in a really interesting way. It's not the stack. I can't remember who does the stack. The Temporal do it according to cardinal direction. So they don't talk about progress through time. They also don't talk about left-right space. They talk about cardinal directions, and they organize the flow of time according to those cardinal directions. Please.
The Hillary arrow just made me think of something. Oddly, how this talk is related to work I've done on creativity. The problem with Hillary is that the arrow, Karen and I have talked about this, the arrow was going forward, but people felt it was the wrong road. It's like you're going forward, but not to where you want to go.
Yeah.
And so I've talked about forward incrementation where you keep moving forward, but sometimes you realize the direction's wrong and you need a redirection.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if people, when you were talking about the future and the past, I wonder whether any of this would be moderated by whether people feel like their lives are going in the right direction or the society is going in the right direction. Because there could be a time when going forward actually doesn't feel like you're going forward. It may even feel like you're going back.
Yeah, yeah. In our questionnaire and in our writing manipulation, we were careful to balance valence so that the effects presumably aren't driven by your positive or negative feelings about past versus future. But I think there's a lot to discover about relationships between direction in space, direction in time, and your attitudes about the different directions. Please.
On the topic of within cultural variations, I'm just wondering out of curiosity, have you done any sort of manipulations with individuals, say like with and without depression? Because we know that depression involves several cognitive biases that are related to focusing on the past. So,
yes, so we, excuse me, we had exactly that same thought. We're in the process of collecting a depressed versus control data set. It's not done, so I don't want to say what the answer is, but as I recall from the first look at the first batch of data, we weren't seeing that depressed people were reporting themselves to be more past focused than the non-depressed controls. So I don't know what to make of that.
is that just individuals with a history of depression, or is it acute episode, like it's currently going on?
I don't know. This work is being done in Granada, and I can't remember. I believe it is. I don't know about the history, but it's people who are currently being treated for depression, and yet aren't revealing themselves to be more past focused. But I think it's a great question.
But it's also logical, because would you expect psychopathology to trump cultural influence? I mean, that's essentially at the heart of it. And I don't know if you would want to jump in there, but I actually might not. I might expect culture to trump the symptomatic expression. So,
Interesting questions for you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you could see influences of both, right? Like being depressed wouldn't make you as past focused as a pardon?
It always depends.
Right. Exactly. Please.
Have you looked at all at how people with time-space synesthesia fit into this model?
No. So actually, but I do have a student who's working on this now, doing space-time and space number reaction time tasks in people with and without, because we have opposing bets about she's a space-time and space number synesthete, and she's certain that synesthetes' snark effects and analogous space-time RT effects will follow their idiosyncratic space-time synesthesia or space number synesthesia. I have reason to believe, based on other work, that these are completely not open to conscious reflection and are conditioned by cultural stuff or linguistic stuff or independent of the synesthesia. But hopefully we'll know soon.
I'm curious, for Moroccans and for maybe older people as well, who tend to have greater focus on the past, do you expect they show sort of reversed temporal Doppler effect, to perceive the past is closer to them?
Yeah, great question. I've been talking with Eugene Caruso about this. We should find out. Yep. There is a paper showing that somebody who's doing work completely independent of ours and also calling their very similar construct temporal focus. I was embarrassed because it turns out that their paper predated ours, and I didn't know about it until afterwards. But now I know. Where, excuse me, they showed that delay discounting reverses across Chinese and American samples. Do you know this paper? And that you can get a similar reversal in Canadians and Americans who are induced to think about the past. So we find that.
What's that paper?
Who asked? Oh, hi.
She's hard to see.
I can send it. I owe you lots of papers. I'll send it.
Okay.
Sorry, hold that thought. Yes. Oh, right. So we have in our Chinese sample, there is my Chinese student said we're not going to be able to get any leverage out of this questionnaire because in Chinese we have this saying about having one foot in the past and one foot in the future. And I was like, well, that's our prediction, right? That Chinese people will be equally inclined toward both, and that's exactly how they look. And they look intermediate between the Spaniards and the Moroccans on the space-time task. Question?
Yeah, how much do you think is the collapsing into lateral plane in gestures and communicative gestures? So if you're sitting in front of me,
Yep.
if I say, this is the distance between two hands, it's not very clear for you to see where my hands are.
Absolutely.
If I say this, it's
Yep.
very clear for you that, I mean some distance between.
Yep.
Is it,
Absolutely.
So it seems like even though you have this 3D space, because of perspective, you're kind of still limited to, there's advantage planes and disadvantage planes.
Right, right. So that's a great point. If you are ever really sleep deprived and need to be knocked out, I have about a 3-page discussion of this in a cognitive linguistics paper. All of the differences between this axis and this axis gesturally, including that we can. This is Archimedes' observation that we can reach a lot farther this way than this way, right? But I think that your point that there's more information value to the same amount of spatial change this way versus this way because of how our eyes work is a very likely explanation. Now, what happens when something that sort of works against all of the explanations that we posited is if you ask people to gesture spontaneously, they activate the mappings that are available to them in language. People think, and in fact gesture researchers think, that they gesture forward and backward for time. If you ask ordinary people and or gesture researchers in the US, how would you gesture about the past, right? Gesture researchers go like this. Ordinary people say, oh, I wouldn't. They say, well, if you were going to, then they go like this, right? We observed not one of these, right, in lots and lots of data. In other cultures, we have it. This is, in fact, an idiom in Italian.
Yeah, I was going to say Italian.
Yeah. Tanti anni fa, right? But not so much in English. Yeah, so why this preference is an open question. I think yours is a very plausible part of the answer. Shall we move on? We're actually, this is really fun for me, but I know some people are going to have to leave, and there's half a talk to give in 12 minutes. So we'll see where we get. So I want to move on. We can refer to these influences that we're seeing in each of these bubbles, right? That what's happening here is that people's temporal thinking is varying relative to their cultural experience, right? I refer to this as cultural relativity. Often people bristle at this term, right? That means something like moral relativism. Sure, it can. You can use these words to mean whatever you want. To me, it means that thinking varies relative to this aspect of your experiential context. And we can, by analogy, talk about how the bodily context could give rise to bodily relativity effects. So this is work that's motivated by an idea that I call the body specificity hypothesis. It's pretty simple. To the extent that our thinking depends on our interactions with the physical environment, right? I mean, Aristotle, Piaget, lots of people have thought this is a reasonable idea. People with different kinds of bodies who interact with their environment in systematically different ways should think differently as a consequence, right? So the intuition here is that the body is part of the context in which we use our brains and minds. And it's via the body. Via the body is the only way that brains and minds can interface with the physical environment, right? Bodies are not all the same. Let's think about what consequences might follow from those differences. So one of the first test beds for the body specificity hypothesis was the mental and neural representation of imagined actions and action language. And I'm going to, with apologies, condense a year's worth of work by one of my former postdocs, Roel Willems, into one slide for the sake of time. Excuse me, the first set of studies we did here was on mental imagery of actions that you perform either with the hands or with other verbs, actions like writing and throwing. And what we see is if you just ask people to imagine these actions, they do so in a body-specific way, using the hemisphere of the brain that controls their dominant hand, even though they're lying perfectly still in the scanner. Righties are using the left motor network, classic motor areas for doing this mental imagery of hand actions compared to other actions. Lefties are using homologous right hemisphere areas. Now, perhaps this should be uncontroversial that imagery follows action, thank goodness, right? More controversially, perhaps, if instead of asking people to imagine actions, you try to prevent them from imagining actions by giving them a speeded, very, very low-level task like lexical decision, you have people reading action verbs like grasp, throw, right versus kick, bite, etc. in the scanner, and then predict which premotor hand areas you're going to see the balance of activation in as a function of their handedness. Righties are using left premotor hand areas when they are implicitly simulating the actions named by these verbs. That's been observed many times before. People attributed it to the left hemisphere dominance of language, right? Well, actually, there's a much more interesting explanation for this, which is that people, as they're lying there motionless in the scanner, mentally simulating these actions, are doing so using the neural correlates of the actions themselves as they would perform them with their particular bodies. This means that when lefties are understanding action verbs for verbs like grasp and throw, they are preferentially activating right premotor areas, an area of the brain that nobody ever suspected was part of our brain's language network. Should we start to think of it that way? Well, one way to address that question is to ask whether this premotor activation is playing any functional role in our understanding of action verbs. And a way to do that is to intervene on these areas using repetitive TMS. So we localize people's premotor hand areas using the scanner and then zap them in one session in the premotor hand area that controls their dominant hand, the other, the homologous premotor hand area that controls their non-dominant hand. And what we show is a selective modulation of, you can't read this, sorry, manual but not non-manual verbs when you're zapping the hemisphere that controls the dominant hand but not the other hemisphere, suggesting that this premotor hand area activity in the correct hemisphere, the dominant hand hemisphere, is playing some functional role in this very simple task that is often used as a measure of word comprehension. So in summary, these studies suggest that the meaning of an action verb like write or throw is not some platonic ideal of that action, nor is it some normative representation of that action as it's performed by the majority of language users, right? Lefties and righties alike talk with mostly right-handers. Instead, the meaning that you're creating is a mental simulation of the action as you would perform it with your particular body. By the way, I'm so jealous that you have a scanner in your building. That's pretty awesome. I'd be happy afterwards to tell people about the evolution of this project. There are some other myths that I think we can pretty easily bust by looking outside of our usual sample. Excuse me. But I want to move on to testing this idea of body specificity, not in sort of this low apple test bed of actions, right? If the body is going to influence cognition anywhere, it's going to influence it for how we think about concrete objects and actions. But that's not what we think about most of the time. Do you know what the most frequent noun is in English year after year? Time. The most frequent nouns are really abstract things: time, life, day, year, right? At least in writing. And by inference, we spend a lot of our time thinking about abstract stuff. Our theories of brain and mind had better be able to explain how we think about abstract stuff. And in particular, thinking about abstract stuff is a real challenge. Thinking about things that we can never perceive through the senses or act upon with the muscles is a real challenge for a theory that prioritizes the role of the body and interaction with the physical world. So one of the abstract domains that we use a lot as a test bed is emotional valence. And language gives us clues about how we conceptualize valence. Just about any abstract domain that has positive or negative emotional charge can be talked about in English and lots of other languages along with the good end up and the bad end down on an imaginary vertical spatial continuum. I would love to be able to talk about some of this work. We don't have time. Some of it actually engages with memory and education work that's going on right here in this department. How do we know that this is not just a way of talking, that it's really a way of thinking, and that activating these mental metaphors has a causal role in our thoughts? Well, if you make people, for example, move objects, randomly assign them to move objects upward or move objects downward while giving them sort of neutral valence memory prompts, they're more likely to retrieve positive valence autobiographical memories while they're moving objects up and negative memories while they're moving objects down, right? So somebody approached me a few years ago about turning this into a therapy. That these were marbles in this study. I'm all for it. If people want to do marble therapy, each morning with your coffee, you move marbles up, right? So you face the day with positive thoughts. I'd love to know if it works. We can harness this for educational purposes. If you're studying words that either have positive or negative meanings, or you assign them positive or negative associations, and you're learning, say, a made-up language, and you place the positive new words on the top shelf and the negative words on the bottom shelf, you remember them about 10 percentage points better than if you use the opposite mapping, and also better than sort of a normal baseline where you just plunk all the flashcards in the same pile. But this isn't really going to advance our story about body specificity. There is another mapping of valence to space in language that provides us some really special leverage. And this is the mapping of good and bad to left-right. So in English, we have expressions like my right-hand man versus 2 left feet, the right answer versus out in left field, right? This is true across languages, across the history of our own language. And these right is good, left is bad patterns in language are reinforced by patterns in non-linguistic cultural conventions. So in our culture, we shake hands, we pledge allegiance to the flag, we swear to tell the truth, all with our right hand. There's really nothing we have to do with our left hand, right? It's just there. But in other cultures, like some Islamic cultures, you're told that you clean yourself with your, that you eat with your right hand because you reserve your left hand for dirty jobs, right? And likewise, every time you step into the mosque, you use your right foot. Every time you step into the toilet, you use your left foot. Question is, why is right good and left bad across languages and cultures? And what is this telling us about people's conceptions of good and bad? Well, here's a story. Maybe right is good and left is bad because most people are right-handed. How does this story work? Well, we know from lots of social psychology experiments that there is a broad link between fluency and valence, right? That in general, people like things better, all else being equal, that they can interact with more fluently, perceptually or motorically. As one social psychologist put it, beauty is in the perceptual fluency of the beholder, right? Now, there's more to beauty than that, but this is a pervasive finding. We have these lopsided bodies, right, that we have to use to interact with the environment. As we do, maybe we come to implicitly associate good things with the side of space in which we can interact more fluently, and bad things with the side of space in which we interact more clumsily, less fluently. Excuse me, and then we generalize this association beyond things that we're actually grabbing to things that just happen to occur on one side of space or the other. Then this implicit association in righties' heads gets enshrined in the right-handed majority, right? Gets enshrined in these linguistic and cultural conventions. How can we tell if this kind of story is on the right track? Well, let's find out how people think about valence implicitly, and in particular, how lefties think about valence implicitly. And this was really exciting to hit upon this test bed because it was the first leverage that I was able to find on a really old question. So anyone familiar with metaphor research is familiar with the fact that there are 2 different metaphor research communities. One comes out of language and psycholinguistics, and the other out of what's now called embodied cognition. And they basically ignore each other. And one group is convinced that we have metaphors in our minds because language has put them there. Because using expressions like feeling up and sinking into depression causes us to build an analogical bridge, in this case, between space and vertical space and valence that we wouldn't have discovered otherwise. The other community says all of this language, the heck with language, all of this comes directly from bodily experience. it is presumably a universal, it's been claimed to be a universal, that there are postural correlates of valence, that we stand tall when we feel good and we slump down when we feel bad. This has been observed in congenitally blind people, et cetera. We generalize these correlations between posture and valence and arrive at this broad mapping that up is good and down is bad. Now, I don't know which of these is right, or what their relative contributions are, or how to find out. Because in this case, in almost every metaphor that anybody has ever written about, language and culture and bodily experience make exactly the same prediction. Here we have some leverage, because if people implicitly map valence to left-right space, and this is based on their exposure to linguistic and cultural conventions, then everybody's going to think right is good. Why? Because regardless of our bodies, everybody has to participate in the same linguistic and cultural conventions, right? Lefties don't get to call the correct answer the left answer. They don't get to shake hands with the left hand, right? They have to talk and act like righties. So alternatively, if we have a mental metaphor linking lateral space and valence that is based on asymmetries in motor fluency, then righties should think that right is good. Well, that's not all that helpful. Both theories predict that. Lefties should think that left is good implicitly, in spite of everything that language and culture is telling them. How do we find out? Well, we did, excuse me, now lots of experiments, which others have followed up in really creative ways, starting with our old friend Bob here, who was asked to put good and bad animals in one box or the other, and people wanted to put the good animal in the box on their dominant side, the bad animal in the box on their non-dominant side. Or we sent them to the planet Fribalia and had them judge which of each pair of fribbles was more or less intelligent, more or less happy or honest, etc. And on average, righties attributed these more positive characteristics to the fribbles on the right, lefties to the fribbles on the left, even though characteristics like intelligence and happiness and honesty wouldn't seem obviously related to the way we use our hands, right? We find the same kinds of effects whether you have people respond with a pen and paper or respond orally without using their hands at all. Excuse me, kids as young as 5 already show this body-based mapping of preference, saying that the bunny on their dominant side is nicer and smarter, and the one on their non-dominant side is meaner and dumber. Beyond the lab, in the real world, if you can consider presidential politics the real world, we have this wonderful natural experiment where in 2004 and 2008, America was good enough to provide a balanced sample of 2 righties and 2 lefties crossed with political party, right? It's like the American people wanted us to find out the answer to the question, how do people gesture spontaneously with their good hand versus their bad hand? And the answer is, if you analyze all of the speech and gesture from the final debates of the 04 and 08 election years, you see just what we would predict, that when people, there's a bias when you are talking about positive things to gesture more with your dominant hand, when you're talking about negative things to gesture with your non-dominant hand. Of course, reverses with the handedness of the presidents or their candidates. Also relevant perhaps to the real world, of course, some people may have experienced this very recently. In voting booths or on ballots, we often have candidates' names listed on the left or the right, right? Well, this is done systematically and is often not counterbalanced. In fact, when I asked John Krosnick, who's the ballot design guru at Stanford, can we do a naturalistic survey on this? The answer was, we can't find a single 2-column ballot county that fully rotates the names through the positions. Now, this is terrifying because in our simulated election, where we randomly dialed 1.3 million Americans, and a few hundred of them got back to us and filled out a fake ballot, thank you, America, lefties were 15 percentage points more likely to vote for the candidate they saw listed on the left of the ballot. Now, suggests possible ballot reforms. People have known about up-down ballot order effects for many years. One suggested resolution was, why don't we array all of the candidates' names laterally? Well, actually, our lateral bias was stronger than our vertical bias. So I think we need another solution. Ask a psychologist how to solve this problem, right? But apparently, it's hard to counterbalance physical levers. So to wrap up this part of the talk, I've told you a story about how motor experience shapes our spatial conception of valence, but all I've shown you are lots of correlational data. how do we know that lefties and righties don't just have some innate wiring that makes them associate good with one side or the other? Well, that would be interesting if it were true, but let's find out. How do we find out? We need to posit the thing that we think matters is asymmetries in motor fluency, so that's the button we need to press, right? We need to intervene on the usual asymmetry that people experience. So people were brought in for a 2-part experiment, what was actually training and test. The first part, they were timed doing this fine motor task. They thought that was the whole experiment, where they have to arrange dominoes on a tabletop according to a certain pattern, moving both their hands symmetrically in synchrony, taking them out of this central box. It's all very straightforward except for one catch, which is that you're randomly assigned to wear a big bulky ski glove on either one hand or the other, with the second ski glove dangling from the same wrist. So it's extremely annoying. But importantly, it's asymmetrically annoying. And the rules are that you have to fix your mistakes before you can move on, which just makes more mistakes, right? And you can't use your free hand to help your gloved hand, right? So this poor guy, he came into the lab as a righty, right? But now he is functionally a lefty in so much as he can act more fluently with his left hand than his right, right? So after about 12 minutes of this, we put them out of their misery. We march them down the hall for what they think is in a different room with a different experimenter for what they think is an unrelated task embedded in a bunch of questionnaires. And it's a hands-free version of our friend Bob here. They're told that Bob loves pandas. He thinks they're good. He hates zebras. He thinks they're bad, or vice versa. Where would Bob put the good animal? Where would Bob put the bad animal? And what we find is that people who have had the glove on their left hand, preserving and enhancing their natural right-handedness, show the usual right is good effect. People who used to have the hand on their glove, now the gloves are off, but they've had this recent asymmetry in motor experience, they've been trained to be, in the relevant regard, functional lefties. They show a complete reversal that is statistically indistinguishable from the effect that we see in natural left-handers. So this gives us evidence that asymmetries in motor fluency are sufficient to determine the direction of this space valence mapping. And the broader point that now we have one example of a mental metaphor, the origin of which we can actually determine because we can distinguish the possible influences of bodily experience from those of language and culture. Now, I would love to talk about how body-specific motor experience can determine the way emotions are organized in our cerebral cortex. But I'm going to skip to the end because I suspect that there are some people who need to run. I'm not sure that would be very satisfying. Let me wrap up, and I'm happy to go back for anyone who wants to stick around. Excuse my voice. To sum things up, language, culture, and the body are ever-present parts of the context in which we use our brains and minds, right? They are parts of our human ecology. And since thinking depends on various aspects of the context, it depends on the specifics of these aspects of our languages, our cultures, and our bodies. To the extent this is a conclusion that's emerging more and more, and from a bunch of the causal interventions that I showed, to the extent that these aspects of our environment are stable, the mental representations that we form appear to be stable over time. When the context changes, though, these representations may change accordingly. Now, an exciting extension of this idea that figures into a framework that I've proposed called ad hoc cognition is that much of the stability of the mind that we enjoy, or at least the apparent stability of the mind, may in fact not inhere. It may be inherent in stable aspects of the world. So this is a kind of generalization of the insight that J.J. Gibson had about the role of the environment in making perception possible. Perhaps it is the environment and invariance or stabilities in the environment that gives us the kind of stability we have or think we have in our brains and minds. By studying how contextual differences lead to cognitive differences, we can discover mechanisms of neural and cognitive development that operate not just within the groups we're studying, but across individuals and groups, right? That looking across groups is a way of testing mechanisms, not just documenting differences, and that In doing this, we can potentially discover cognitive universals that are not innate, right? These can arise from interactions with aspects of the physical or social world that are shared across all humans, right? And this tool can allow us to discover them. On the flip side, cognitive diversity can arise as a consequence of what in many cases may be universal cognitive processes that operate in distinctive physical and social contexts. And I think that's what we're seeing examples of here. Before I close, let me mention this work on cognitive diversity dovetails with an effort that you heard about a moment ago to increase diversity in science. This is the think tank. The think tank is a mobile neuroscience lab on wheels. It's topped with a giant glowing brain that we call the Illuminoggin, which we can dismount from each lobe of the brain, and the motor strip light up selectively in each hemisphere. We can dismount it from the brain for classroom work. This truck allows us to get beyond the university walls out into what in Chicago is a surround of low SES neighborhoods that are very much set apart from the community that the university exists in. And this separation is not good for society, and thus the wheels. One of the ways that we attempt to increase diversity in science is by providing these diverse set of near-peer role models to the high school kids who are surrounding us. The hope is that this crew, the Brainiacs, can change the way people think about who scientists are, what scientists look like, who can become scientists. We have two programs. One we call Street Science, where we pull up to sidewalk fairs, community events, and put on demos, sort of a broad and fairly shallow engagement. The other is a little bit deeper, where we hijack classrooms because the teachers in the public school system are so nice to us, and they allow us to bring into their classrooms a growth mindset intervention. We've refined it down to a 1-hour intervention where, based on Carol Dreck's work, we try to impart to kids the message that brains are not like bricks, right? Brains are like Play-Doh, right? And that our minds are like our muscles. We can pump them up with exercise. And hope that we can see from our program some of the remarkable outcomes of other growth mindset work. We don't know the long-term outcomes, but we have some really encouraging short-term outcomes. When we do our basically our exit interviews, we get comments like, how could we make this class better for the next person? Maybe make it longer, make it like 10 extra minutes longer, right? These are not kids who like school. This girl who was very hesitant to do our prism goggle demonstration at the end asked, how does this class affect the way you think about science and scientists? She wrote, it makes me think that I can be the next Tesla with practice. So I don't think we can ask for more than that. So thank you for your attention. Please.
A couple of questions about your experimental manipulations.
Yeah.
You know, where you're interfering with natural tendencies, the glove, and then the early ones.
Yeah.
Getting close to Morocco. So yeah, you can, with a fairly small intervention, change a fairly powerful natural tendency. But am I correct in assuming that those effects fade pretty quickly? You know, we have not studied this, and it's not because we don't want to know the answer. It's two other reasons. One is just that, you know, somebody's got to do it. We only have so many grad students. The other is that how long it lasts is not necessarily critical for answering the question that caused us to design these experiments, right? Which is this kind of experience causally sufficient to produce this kind of behavior? Now, I really want to know the answer. We have some insights. So this is an opportunity to address this question that comes up a lot: is how the heck can such a brief exposure to a new pattern of experience overwhelm a lifetime of contrary experience? This is perhaps most dramatic in the left-right valence and the left-right time cases, because you're not just giving them something new and different, you're giving them something that is directly opposite to the way they usually think. So
borrowing an idea from Nelson Goodman from Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, I think what's going on here is that our mental metaphors, these are organized hierarchically. Nelson described, you can think of these mappings like progress through time equals progress through space as an intuitive hypothesis, to borrow Nelson's terminology, and that we have families of hypotheses generated by an overhypothesis. An overhypothesis constitutes a family of specific hypotheses. So where do they come from? Well, the overhypothesis presumably comes from relationships that are observable in the natural world. It is simply a fact of our physical world that as things travel through space, more time passes. That's always true. And it's always true no matter what direction things are traveling, right? We could either come with this knowledge built in because it's kind of, survival relevant, or we could learn this through the massive amounts of exposure to this correlation that we get early in life, right? And that exposure is to this correlation in lots of different, in presumably all directions. Then we become enculturated, in this case, through conventions like calendars and reading. In our culture, we develop a preponderance of evidence for one of these mappings within the family. In particular, farther to the right in space is farther into the future in time. Excuse me. Why does this help us? Well, it helps us because when we are giving people these new mappings, they're not actually new. We're neither creating new mappings nor destroying the old ones. We're just changing the weight of evidence for one of these mappings that's already included in the overhypothesis. Now we have a number of, aside from this being a possible explanation for the data like I've showed you, we have a number of other lines of evidence that this hypothesis seems to be on the right track. I call this hierarchical mental metaphors theory. One is that if you try to train people on a mapping that is not present in the overhypothesis but is structurally identical. So the work that I haven't talked about is about how language influences our mental representations of musical pitch. We talk about pitches as high and low. Other cultures talk about pitches as thick or thin. My student Sarah Dolscheid has done a bunch of work on this, showing that you find behavioral evidence for these mappings when you use non-linguistic tasks. Dutch speakers can't help incorporating height information into their pitch representations. Farsi speakers can't help in incorporating thickness into their pitch representations. You can train Dutch speakers to think about pitch in terms of thickness just by training them to use the Farsi-like vocabulary, that high pitches are thin and low pitches are thick. Okay, now that, we posit, is included, that mapping, high pitches are thin, low pitches are thick, is included in the overhypothesis because it's a relationship that's observable in the natural world. It's unavoidable. Think about big dogs and little dogs, right? Big drums and little drums. It's everywhere, thick strings and thin strings.
This is Roger Brown's, right?
Sure, absolutely. When Sarah tried to train subjects randomly assigned from the same population, instead of teaching them this mapping that is encoded in Farsi, teaching them the exact opposite using the same training manipulation, the same dosage, the same words, but reversing the mapping, the training had no effect. This is what we expected because that mapping wasn't there to be strengthened. But I'm excited to hear other thoughts about, pardon?
Roger didn't say that.
No. He said a lot of good stuff, though. But I'm excited to hear other thoughts about how this kind of representational flexibility is possible.
I have to go, but I love the talk. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope we can talk more.
I hope so too.
Okay. Yeah.
We should give you a plaza, right?
Yes.
Oh.
Have you done that yet?
Thank you. Thank you.